Hey guys, today I'm back in Scrap Mechanic, and I wanted to try making a Radial engine. Now, I've made a few engines in Besiege before, but none in Scrap Mechanic. So, let's get right into it. So I just loaded into the sandbox, and the first thing I did was just built up a little bit of a base to start working on. Now, I did this for two reasons. The first one is that it's a little bit easier to get under things, just to look at them and be able to place stuff. And the other is that I can disconnect it from the ground at any time to be able to make it a free creation. I can drive it or whatever I need to do. So I started out by putting a bearing on the ground and just putting some aluminum pieces down. And you can see here as I hit it with the sledgehammer, ends up rotating just fine. And basically, I'm just going to use bearings like this to be able to get the rotation of my engine. So I just put down some aluminum pieces, put down a bearing, after putting down a couple more aluminum pieces to make one of the cranks, and then a bearing as well to finish off the crank, I can start putting down one of the pistons to interact with it. So I just started out by putting down 3 aluminum pieces and a bearing on the end of it, so it's able to swivel up and down to be able to stay connected to the crankshaft. And I put a piston on it as well, and that'll be what I'm going to use to drive the engine. And then I'm also putting down a seat here, and what this is going to do is lock all the bearings it's connected to, so that they're not able to swivel down at all. So I started out just by attaching it to the crankshaft like this, and it looked like those 2 blocks were touching, but as I deleted the seat, you can see here they just fell apart. I've never actually had to deal with this many bearings before, so I was a little surprised that it just didn't stay connected. And you can even see here as I relocked the bearings, they were connected. So I needed a bit of a different solution to be able to connect the piston to the crankshaft. So the next thing I did was just build up a little bit of a setup here at the crankshaft again. And now as I run into it, you can see how it rotates. And once again, I'm just using a seat to be able to lock those bearings in place. And just like I did before, I'm putting in a couple aluminum blocks with a bearing on the end, and then another aluminum block with a piston on it. And as that piston expands and contracts to be able to drive around the crankshaft. But this time, you see I put 2 aluminum blocks on top of where the piston is. And what this is going to do is hold it onto the crankshaft so that I'll be able to drive it around. So just doing a simple test here by connecting up a button to the piston, you can see nothing ends up happening. And it's actually because I locked all the bearings, so the piston's pushing against effectively just a wall and can't move. And finally here, as I remove all of the bearings, you can see as I push the button, it ends up sort of rotating and then glitching out, but this is actually my fault because I have the piston extending too far and it's pushing the crankshaft further than it's supposed to go, and this ends up having it glitch out. Here I actually improved the setup a bit. I didn't show it because it's like pretty much exactly what I made before, but you can see as I push the button, it begins to rotate the crankshaft. And really that's all I needed to be able to start working on the engine, since I have some way of coupling the pistons to the crankshaft. So with that, I just started working on my first engine design, and just like I did before, I put down a big aluminum plate attached to the ground, just a couple feet on the edge, and then finally just filled everything in with another aluminum plate. So I started out by putting in a bearing, and then putting 2 aluminum pieces on it, and then once again using a seat to lock that bearing in place, and really just started making the basic shape of a crankshaft. And at the time, it also occurred to me I don't know how to make a radial engine, so I went to the Wikipedia to look up how to do that, and found this good graphic, which is pretty much everything I needed. So you can see here, all the pistons are on the same plane. This is pretty much the most important part of the radial engine. So the crankshaft looks a little weird here, it's like an L shape, and I had to put a bearing on the end of it, and then just put a few aluminum pieces on top of that. So I ended up just locking those in place. And the next part is, since I have a 4-cylinder engine, I'm supposed to build like a sort of rhombus shape. Now, I'm not going to do that because there's not going to be a lot of force on the engine. So what I'm going to do instead is have an X shape, which accomplishes the same task. It's just a lot neater for me to make. So you can see here I have that X shape, and actually it doesn't need to be 3 blocks tall, it only needs to be 1. So I end up just fixing that, and then putting some bearings on the end of it like this. And after putting those bearings on, I put some aluminum blocks on top of those. And now those blocks are all able to freely rotate, and that's where I'm going to be attaching the pistons to. So speaking of those pistons, I'm going to start putting that in now. So I just put in a big aluminum stack, and then I have to put a bearing on the top of it, and this is going to allow the piston to swivel from side to side to stay coupled to the engine without just breaking. So to attach it to the engine, I'm doing basically what I did before. I'm just putting a ring around that aluminum pillar attached to the crankshaft. And you can see I got that here. And now if I just put in a button and tell a piston to expand a bit, and then unlock all of the bearings that I need to, you can see as I expand the piston, it begins to rotate the crankshaft. Now it's not going to work really well yet, because for the radial engine to work, you really need more pistons to be attached to it to sort of hold that center shape in place. Because that X pattern, or that X rhombus shape thing that I put in before, is actually supposed to stay pretty much fixed with respect to the ground. Like its angle is supposed to stay fixed. So with more pistons in place, you sort of see how that works. And speaking of which, I started putting in this other piston as well. And this one's actually interesting, because since it's on the other side of the engine, it's supposed to start out fully expanded. Now I actually set it just a little bit too close to the engine there, so I had to move it back a little bit, or at least the pillar where it's sitting on back a little bit, and you can see now the piston is extended, and it's attached to the engine in a very similar way I did before. And now if I just unlock all of the pistons, you can see here what I'm talking about that X shape staying pretty much fixed with respect to the ground. So it rotates around in a circle, but it doesn't itself rotate. Now there's already a lot of issues you can see with parts creating a lot of debris, and it's a little concerning because that means there's a lot of friction and just glitchiness in the system. I was hoping once I added the other 2 pistons though that would sort of just go away. So I relocked all the bearings and started working on the third piston. Now this one's a little different from the other two, since it's actually going to have to start out slightly rotated. And the reason for that is since the top part of the engine ends up rotating in a circle, the two pistons on the sides end up having to tilt a little bit to the side to be able to couple to the engine. So to lock those in place exactly where I needed them to be, I used a controller block and then told the controller block to rotate each of the bearings 15 degrees. 15 degrees isn't perfect here, but it's really good, and it ends up getting them close enough to where they need to be. And you can see that here, they're close to each other. So I started working on that ring setup to attach it to the rest of the crankshaft. And after I put down just a few aluminum pieces, I ended up getting rid of the connection from the controller to the piston block and just pushed it in place a little bit. And this allows me to get a little bit of a tighter fit and almost finish the ring. Now to just get it pushed in place that final amount, what I did is got a piston like this, ended up telling it to expand. This is just a temporary piston, but it just holds it in place so that I'm able to complete that ring. And you can see that here. So with that third piston done, the fourth one is all that I have left, and it's almost identical to how the third one got on, except I have a better way of doing it now. So similarly, just have to expand the piston just a little bit to start out with, and then just start that ring shape. And once I finished up that ring, things seemed to be fine, but once I detached the bearing that's attached to the crankshaft from the controller block, it just glitched out. So to fix that, I just sort of had to repeat the process that I did before, except this time it ended up just working, so nice. And after I did that, I unlocked all the bearings so they're able to rotate freely. I also got rid of the controller block. And once I did that, I was pretty much ready to start working on the logic. So the logic I thought was pretty simple. Basically what I'm just going to have is two SR latches, which can store 2 bits of memory, which gives me 4 unique states. And one of those states is going to be for each of the pistons, more or less. And by having all of these states, I'll be able to have the machine automatically rotate itself around, and I won't have to manually hit keys or anything to keep the engine running. So here you can see I got one of my SR latches in place, and when I hit the buttons, I can toggle each of the sides on and off. I'm just deleting those buttons though, because what I actually want to be able to toggle those on and off are sensors. They're going to be looking up to see if the crankshaft is above them, and if it is, they'll toggle the correct SR latch, which will turn on a different set of pistons and keep the engine rotating. So I'm just hooking up the sensors where they need to go. And now finally I'm adding the correct control lines, which tell the correct pistons to turn on and off. And the first few were fine, but it was when I added this third line that things just went badly. It expanded fine at first, but then it just got very glitchy. I guess I just had too much force on the center of the crankshaft, and Scrap Mechanic just started freaking out. And this kind of happened a lot. Pistons would just randomly free themselves from their connection to the crankshaft. So I tried a bunch of different solutions, and one of them was using mesh blocks to connect the pistons to the crankshaft. And these have lower friction, so I was hoping that they'd freak out less, but that was not the case, and it ended up being worse, if anything. So another thing I wanted to try was adding suspension to the piston connections, but when I tried deleting it, that happened. And when I looked away and then looked back, they were there. So amazing, it just works. So then I added in the suspension, and I was hoping what the suspension would do was maybe alleviate some of those just random oscillations that were occurring, and basically just stop it from glitching out. So I just had to move it in place and then brace it to the crankshaft. And once I did that, I connected all of them in the same way. And just weird things started happening, like this. And eventually when I started connecting up that last piston, it really exploded this time. So I just thought everything I was doing was probably making it a bit worse. And I knew what I needed to do, but unfortunately I needed a bigger crankshaft to make it work. So I just started working on that. Now fortunately, I got to keep everything that I learned from before, so it was pretty easy just to carbon copy what I had, for the most part. There are a few differences though, and I'll highlight those. So I'm just starting off by putting in the bearings like I did before, and this time I'm putting wheels under the bearings. Now I thought wheels might be the best choice here, because similar to my marble machine video, they seem to behave a bit better with collisions, and that makes sense since they're literally designed to collide with the ground. So I was hoping that if I used those, it would stop the engine from just glitching out. So I just connected the first piston up to the wheel here. I'm not going to show you the rest of these since I already did that, and it's exactly the same thing. But I finally connected up the last piston like this, and things seem to be okay. But one weird thing is you see all the wheels are rotating here. I have no explanation for this, it just seems like when wheels are under pressure, they just start rotating. Here I actually put a logic gate on one of the wheels, and you can see it just rotating like crazy. So I just had to add back in the sensors, and you can see this time they're spread out further from the center than before. There's actually no reason for this except the crankshaft is bigger, so I can get away with doing that. And now I'm adding back in a logic, but you'll see I actually have 4 more logic gates than before. And these top 4 gates are for disconnecting all of the sensors from the rest of the circuitry. And the effect this accomplishes is basically allowing me to start and stop the engine without having to disconnect control lines. I can just flip a switch and get it done. So it's just sort of a quality of life thing. Definitely not necessary though. And once I got all those connections done, I just used the bottom gates once again to make 2 SR latches. Set all the top gates to be NAND gates, set all the bottom gates to be NOR gates, and this time I also added in 4 push buttons and permanently left them there. And what these buttons are going to let me do is manually switch the state of the engine to let me rotate it around how I like. And that's good for troubleshooting or just manually rotating it just to test things in general. So I added a couple control lines to the pistons, and you can see here, immediately starts rotating, which was a really good sign that nothing was exploding or anything. In fact, I didn't see any signs of it being glitchy. Well, except for the wheels starting to rotate quickly, but I don't think that was necessarily an issue. And then finally, I hooked up those last 2 control lines, and honestly, things seemed to be going well. So I started manually hitting the buttons to see if it would work, and for the most part, things seemed good. So I flipped the automatic switch, and I just had to hit one of the manual buttons to get it to start moving. And once I did that, you can see the lights are automatically switching, which means that the pistons are automatically getting different signals to expand and contract to keep the engine rotating. So pretty much the engine was working at this point. And it was totally stable too. You can see I'm just standing on it here, and it showed absolutely no signs of stopping or having any hesitation. I was really hopeful that meant that this engine was A, going to work fine, and B, actually going to be able to sustain a load. So after I got the engine working, the next step was to somehow get that rotation from the engine to a wheel, so I'd be able to drive a car with this. Now, my first thought was to use a 4-bar linkage. Since any gearing system, I was really worried was going to get glitchy since Scrap Mechanic isn't exactly amazing with the physics. So the easiest way to make a 4-bar linkage, well, at least what I thought, was just going to be using 4 pistons like this, and then extending those pistons out. Now, the reason that this is good is that these bars are going to end up rotating into each other, so it's important that they don't have any collision, and it turns out that piston arms don't have any collision, so that ends up just working out very well. So to get this to work, I made a wheel 15 units away from the first one, and then just had to lock all those bars in place in the same exact spots that they spawned from on the first wheel. Now, as I rotate this bottom wheel, it should rotate the top wheel, but something ended up binding, and then all the bars ended up separating from each other, which just lets me know that this isn't really gonna work. Now, I ended up making a separate 4-bar linkage here just for fun to prove that it could work, and it ended up rotating fine, but it's way too big, and if I put a wheel on this, it would still be bigger than the wheel itself, so the rotational mechanism wouldn't really work then. So my next thought was to just use a gearing system, which is what I said before, but I was really worried about it being glitchy. So I just put on 2 wheels as the base since wheels end up not glitching so much, and using just a few mesh blocks. Now, again, mesh blocks are good because they have low friction, and I was hoping in a gearing system, this will allow them to slide right past each other, no problem. Now, you see as I rotate the bottom wheel, the top wheel ends up rotating too. So that was already a good start. And now I have the bottom wheel automatically rotating, and really seems to be working just fine. But here they ended up getting stuck on each other, but there's only a minor problem. I could fix this just by deleting some of the mesh blocks, and after I did that, it pretty much was a good gearing system. Now, the only issue was that I have really only one way of gearing this, and that's 1 source gear and 1 final gear. I can't really have any gears in between, or else things are going to end up binding it stuck like we saw before. But I was hoping maybe I'd be able to get that to work, so really just had to rebuild the engine. Now, there's 2 reasons for this. The first one is you see here I'm putting down a wheel and a bunch of spokes. This is so that at the very bottom of the crankshaft, I'll have a gear rotating around. But the other reason I needed to remake this is because before I made it directly attached to the ground, so I had no way of detaching it. And unfortunately, that ended up costing me, and I had to remake it now. So I just remade the rest of the engine with all the pistons and stuff. And this is one of the changes I made as well. Basically, what I'm having is a piston holding up a block, and what this block is going to do, well, I'm putting a ring on it like this. And this ring is going to end up holding all of the sensors. Now, the reason I chose to put this on a piston that's extended, the gear is able to rotate directly into the piston without having any collision issues, so it just is an easy way of supporting all of those sensors. Now, one of the other changes I made is if you see here, this piston's sort of glitching out a little bit, and it was worrying me that it'd slip out. So just as a precautionary measure, I ended up putting a string of aluminum blocks on top of all of the pistons, and this helped secure them to the crankshaft a bit better, and it didn't have any problems popping out. So I wanted to start putting in the gearing system, and just putting in a first gear like this was pretty easy. Just use some mesh blocks, since again, they have low friction. And as the crankshaft rotates, you can see the gear rotates as well. So I continued just by putting down a bunch of wheels, and I put these on all the corners, and really that's just gonna be the car. It's a very wide car, but it's fine. So I'm also putting down a gear on the front left wheel, and what this is gonna do is just allow me to drive it, and it's mainly how I'm gonna apply power to that wheel. So what I did is just made that gear. I had used some wedge blocks in the ends to have it slot into the wheel a little bit better. But once I had that, it was pretty much just my job to make a gear train going from the crankshaft to the front wheel. So that's exactly what I did. These gears were a little bit glitchy though. They ended up meshing with each other fine, but altogether they had a lot of issues. And finally here, got all the gears in place. I deleted all the connection points attaching the rest of this machine to the ground, so it should be totally free at this point. So you can see here, just to start out, the engine's rotating, but it's not rotating the gears, and they end up slipping past each other because the gears aren't meshing properly. And even when I force them to mesh properly by hitting with the sledgehammer, it still doesn't rotate anything right. So I had to do a pretty much complete redesign of a lot of the gears, and even once I did that, it was still not rotating this last gear properly. Ended up just really making some glitchy movement, and it didn't even rotate in one consistent direction. It was going forwards and backwards. It just was not working. So I deleted all of the gears I had, because I thought there's gotta be a better way to do this. And I ended up figuring that one out after just a little bit of thinking. And basically what I'm gonna have is a wheel in the center of the robot, right next to the crankshaft. And it's gonna make it really easy to transfer power from the crankshaft directly to that wheel. In fact, I'm actually gonna need no intermediary gears. The output of the crankshaft is gonna directly rotate the wheel. So I got that wheel in place, and then I'm also getting the gear spokes in place like this. And now I just gotta change the crankshaft just a little bit to have it mesh with that gear. And you can see here as the crankshaft rotates, it rotates that gear, which is directly attached to the wheel. And it's moving the car, so honestly, it's not too bad. So all that was left at this point was pretty much just to make it look pretty and finish off the car. So to do that, I just need to add in some steering, and I just want to have the steering be high up off the ground so that you can see the engine and all that beneath you, which I think would be pretty cool. So I built up a little bit of an aluminum frame to get that to work, and also put in the staircase. And once I had the staircase in place, I put in a seat. And for the steering, I didn't want to focus on it too much since the video is about the engine, not really the car. So I just went for kind of a funny solution where I'm going to be able to push down this wheel in the back and pivot the car wherever I want it to go. So you can see here as I push the wheel, it ends up lifting up the back of the robot. And now going for a quick test, you can see that I can lift it up and pivot the car from side to side. And now I also color-coded everything just to make it a bit easier to see what's happening. So the yellow is the crankshaft, the purple is the sensors, which are controlling all the logic. The blue is technically part of the crankshaft, but it's that X rhombus shape that I had before, so I thought of making it a different color. And I made all the pistons red. So guys, thanks for watching. This is definitely a bit of a harder video to do, took a bit of research to figure out exactly how to get the radial engine to work, but glad it did end up working. Scrap mechanic's a little more glitchy than I would like. It made making this a little unfulfilling at points, but ended up working out in the end, so I guess I can't complain too much. So, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to ask below, and otherwise, until next time.